Time now for our rants and raves, starting with Roy.
Well, I have a rant that will morph into a rave, but it's mainly a rant. And it has to do with the New York Times and a headline that appeared this week that, even though it sounded rather bland, the headline was simply, "Trump urges unity versus racism." How could there be an objection to that? Was the headline that was put the day before his trip down to Dayton and El Paso. And the headline was in the early edition, and it caused a huge stir among, first of all, the other staffers when they saw it, and then Dean Baquet, the executive editor, who claims he had never seen it. So Dean Baquet was very upset when he heard all about this. He had the headline changed. The headline came out saying, and we have it up there on the board now, "Assailing hate, but not guns," and then a subhead that said, "Trump in speech says little about putting curbs on weapons." What the rave part of it is, just to move very quickly, is the fact that the New York Times started explaining why this happened, that the editors at the very top level are not always involved with those headlines that are written because they're so concerned with the online changes that go on, and the fact that Dean Baquet gave a couple of interviews to explain what's happening in print newspapers helps us understand why.
I mean, we should say the outrage is that a lot of people felt that Trump himself,
that was the obvious nuance from that.
Racism. And
well, let me pile a rant on your rant and rave, which is for the people who, in a snit, canceled their subscriptions to the New York Times. I'm glad they are people who have never, ever made a mistake in their lives.
Okay, Lylah.
Well, I have a rave for the Washington Post and the massive correction they ran this week on a July story that ran in their food section. They put a staffer on to do some fact-checking and re-reporting. They found proper name errors. They found dates that were incorrect. They found factual errors having to do with the circumstances as they were reported. They found data misinterpreted. And it was just really heartening to see all of these corrections actually made public. The mea culpa is the kind of thing that goes a long way to rebuilding trust in the media. It's the kind of thing that editors hate to see, that makes writers cringe, and frankly, that can torpedo a freelancer's career. But that's my rave because I'm glad to see it out there.
I thought it was a sort of almost like an overcorrection. In all honesty, I wanted them to just say, look, this story was a mess. There was a lot of mistakes in it. We regret that. Instead, they printed I thought it was a little bit of overkill.
That's their policy, but the Globe has done it before, too. 20 years ago, there was a massive, massive correction involving Boston University and John Silber.
It's a little
New York Times does it all the time. I agree that that's much more serious than this, but the saying, this is what was wrong, we had a staffer re-report it, here's what it should have said.
Got more reading than the first article.
It did. It did.
John.
So the National Association of Black Journalists, NABJ, had their annual convention, and apparently in connection with this convention every year, they do a survey of African-American attitudes toward the media, and this year's survey found that black consumers have higher rates of confidence in both local and national news, and have a higher approval rate for the role the press plays as a political watchdog than whites or Hispanics. I just thought that was very interesting.
I agree. It's really interesting.
Maybe it speaks to the degree of your confidence and trust in the media depends on how badly you're marginalized by the news of the day.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Dan.
I have a rant for Facebook. It's been reported, I know, well, this is a bad one.
I know, I saw that.
Facebook is getting ready to unveil a new mobile product, and they are going to be showering millions of dollars on some of the biggest media players in the country, possibly the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. Meanwhile, they have made it harder and harder for local news organizations to appear in people's news feeds unless those news organizations pay to be sort of upgraded in the news feed, which they can't afford to do. So Facebook talks over and over about how we're here to help with the local news crisis, and then they do
What should we make it clear is they're buying their content. I don't understand how that's going to be a good economic model for the Times, the Wall Street Journal, any of those guys, but let's see. And people won't be subscribing if they can get it in the news feed.
Well, that's true, too.
Yeah. All right, well, finally, I have a generic rant tonight. As soon as Dayton and El Paso shootings happened, I saw legitimate news organizations quoting this old trope about how many mass shootings there have been in 2019. And the current figure they claim is 248. But that's just not right. And it's actually the wrong terminology. It should be mass terrorism. Because a lot of these shootings, if you'll read it, it says 4 shot outside of a bar in Boston, 4 shot inside a car outside of a bar in Washington, D.C. We're not talking about targeted shootings where it's a drug deal called Met. We're talking about random mass shootings with assault rifles and that kind of thing.
With a political intent.
It's an agenda where
Right.
you're aggrieved or you're a supremacist or something. It's not like bang, bang, you're dead because, you screwed me on a drug deal. Right. And it's like, to use that terminology, it's not fair to either group, because of course being a victim of any crime is horrible, but being thrown into something that's a mass hysteria, like a mass, it's not right. And consequently, if you really parse out, there have been a couple dozen this year that what I would consider in the category of mass terrorist shootings.
I think you're right. It's a good idea to try to separate the two. By the way, they don't all have to be political. I mean, the Newtown shooting wasn't political, and that was one of the worst ever.
Yeah, that's a good point.
All right, that's it for our show. Tell us what you think. Email us, tweet us, send us a comment. We're always on it. beatthepress.org.